All right, welcome everybody. This week we're going to be talking about basic Linux security, and really we're just going to be going through a few slides today, and most of the work this week is going to be a writing assignment where I have you guys look at some of the technology stacks of other companies. But we will come back to Linux security once we get more into the Apache web server, and once we get more into building out our own servers for production. We'll be touching back on firewalls and IP tables and all the things we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, why security? So the biggest thing I like to tell people, especially when they're new and getting into server ops and DevOps, is that your server will be hacked. It's just a matter of time. And what we want to do is we obviously want to try to mitigate that as much as possible, and there's lots of things that we can do to help make that more difficult. And when I say your server will be hacked, it's just a matter of time, depending on where your server is located, the visibility of your site, what network it's on. We'll kind of determine that. But for instance, at Michigan State, when I used to work in the IT department at Michigan State, we would get scans. Our servers would get scanned all the time looking for open ports, false logins. They try. It's all brute force attacks to try to get into the servers, and all it takes is one insecure WordPress site or one weak password, and an entire server can be compromised. So there's things we need to do to make it difficult for hackers to get into our computer, and they'll usually just move on to the next easier target. So why security? Your server will be hacked. It's just a matter of time. Web software is inherently insecure. For those of you that follow Ruby on Rails, you'll know the last few weeks have been fairly trying for that community. There's been some fairly major exploits that have been found in Ruby on Rails that essentially allow a hacker to have full root access to servers via a secured Rails server. So very serious security holes. A lot of DevOps people were up very late that night making fixes. So web software is inherently insecure. We also want to secure our servers because it's important to be a responsible tenant, web tenant, and homeowner. If you're going to be operating a server on the internet, you don't want to add to the huge list of bots that are out there and become a member of a botnet. You want to make sure that your server is secure so that it can't be then used to infect other people's servers. And the other reason is Johnny Law. For some people, specifically in the credit card industry, in the higher education industry, and also in the healthcare industry, have to adhere to specific security standards for their servers to even be online. And I'm talking, of course, of the HIPAA standards and the FERPA standards, and all of those are very important to keeping our very sensitive data secure. And there are laws that govern how we should be managing that data. We're not going to get into those specific healthcare and financial laws, but be aware if you go into companies that deal in those areas, you will have to adhere to specific regulations regarding data security. So, common attacks, brute force. I'm going to try a bunch of really secure passwords and see if I can hack into your server. So the setting the password is the same as your username, probably not a smart idea. And these are just basic security requirements of using secure passwords, using secure usernames, and not making things easy on the attackers. Another common type of attack is a distributed denial of service attack. And this isn't essentially your server is not necessarily getting hacked into at this point. What's happening is a hacker will flood your server with more requests than it could possibly handle, and it will bring the server down that way. It'll essentially kill the processes on the server. This has happened to all sorts of large, high-profile sites, and you could have extremely secure servers and still be susceptible to a denial of service attack because it really has nothing to do with gaining root access to the server. There are ways to mitigate distributed denial of service attacks with routers and all sorts of networking. And we're not going to touch on that too much, although we will talk about later on in the semester a service called Cloudflare, which does do some distributed denial of service prevention. Finally, another common attack is cross-site scripting. And this is where people gain access to your server through insecure programming in web applications. So by changing variable names in a URL, for instance, or by trying to circumvent security that way. So these are software written in Ruby on Rails and PHP, or really any web framework, can be susceptible to cross-site scripting. And this is mostly determined by the quality of the developers that are working on the software and whether or not they're writing secure code. Sometimes frameworks can have bugs, and you could have the most secure code written, but a kind of a hidden bug in the underlying framework might also cause cross-site scripting attacks. And this is similar to what happened with the Ruby on Rails attack the last few weeks. But those are essentially the ways that hackers are going to gain access to our systems: brute force, distributed denial of service, or trying to hack into the actual software or website that's running publicly on the internet. So, preventing and monitoring attacks. The first thing we can look at on our servers to prevent or to monitor for attacks is the auth log. And this is basically where the server reports who's been logging into the system, the attempts to log into the system, and all sorts of information regarding the user access to the system. So we'll know if root has been invoked. We'll know if there's been a bunch of passwords that have been tried and failed. We'll know what new groups have been created. So this is kind of where we monitor for general information about the server. And this is where sometimes we'll find, if you check your auth log, your authorization logs on a busy server, you'll see lots of different failed login attempts from really crazy IP addresses and things like that. And this is where we can help mitigate them, and then in the future use a firewall to try to prevent those users from coming in. So the auth log is your first step. You can find that at var log auth.log in your on your Linux servers. And you can kind of scroll through there, and I encourage you to go through, if you still have a server spun up, to take a look at it and see what you find in there. Firewalls are also another way to mitigate these types of attacks, and a firewall is essentially a hardware or software-based system that only allows specific traffic in and blocks all other traffic. So one of the firewalls that comes built into Linux is the IP tables firewall, and we can use this to restrict and all sorts of access to our server. So for example, if we're only running a web server, well, we can shut off access to all the other ports on the computer so that if a port scan goes through, it'll look like our server doesn't even exist. The only port that will allow through is our port 80 for Apache, or port 443 for Secure Apache. Another way to use firewalls is we can allow our developers to have a way into the server in a very secure manner. So we can say we want SSH to be open, but only for a specific range of IP addresses. And those IP addresses could be specific computers of our developers that have access to the server. So we can really, really lock things down nicely with IP tables. Now, IP tables is a little confusing to use, and it takes a while to get used to the syntax and how it works, but it can be very, very powerful if used properly. We can also use hardware firewalls, which are actual appliances that sit in a rack with a server. They function the same way, they just have a lot more processing power. It's essentially a dedicated computer only to running a firewall. And those become a little bit more complex, and you typically find those in larger data centers. But they're still very useful for smaller data centers and servers if you want a dedicated hardware firewall. So this is a quick example of IP tables. And IP tables comes default on your Ubuntu Linux, so you don't have to install this. And basically, we create rules in IP tables similar to what we do in our other pieces of software on Ubuntu Linux, basically telling IP tables what packets we want to allow in and what packets we want to reject. So in this case, what we're doing here is we're only accepting packets from port 80 and port 443, which, if you're familiar with web servers, are the public HTTP port and HTTPS, which is the secure port on most web servers, and that's at 443. So this very, very simple rule would only allow packets to come in on those two ports. Another way we mitigate security issues on the web, and particularly on web servers, is with SSL. And SSL certificates are essentially allow us to send information from server to browser in an encrypted fashion. So if you are logging into a website, or you're giving a website your credit card information, you're going to want to make sure that that server, that website, has a valid SSL certificate, so that you know your credit card information is being sent encrypted. Because if it's not being sent over port, or if it's not being sent through SSL and through secure means, your password or your credit card information or your personal address is essentially being sent over the internet in plain text. So there is no security, and someone that's sniffing packets could easily sniff your plain text password and get it that way. That does not happen very often, but it's generally smart not to put sensitive information into a website that does not have an SSL certificate. And there are different kinds of SSL certificates. You can sign your own SSL certificates. These will more often than not give you a warning when you go to the website that says this is an untrusted SSL certificate. That doesn't always mean it's untrusted. Usually it just means that it's not properly signed. So a lot of times for internal websites or for project websites, we'll use unsigned certificates because we're the only customers and we know the certificate is valid because we issued it ourselves. You never want to use an e-commerce website that does not have a signed public key certificate. So companies like Google and Amazon, they all have gone through a process to verify that they are who they say they are. And then the signing authorities actually say, yes, this is a secure certificate. And yes, Google has gone through the process of issuing those different certificates. And in the notes below, you'll see I've added a link to a site that explains the different levels of key certificate signing and what that means. And generally there's a cost to getting a certificate signed, and it can be fairly marginal, maybe $100 a year, all the way up to thousands of dollars a year, depending on exactly what type of certificate you want to have and whether or not it's signed by an organization or just a website. It really depends on how secure you want to go. So that is basic Linux security. If you do these things and look at some of these particular security issues, you can be relatively sure that your server is going to be safe. Is it a 100% effective? Absolutely not. It's never going to be 100% effective. And even some of the most secure networks, and I'm speaking about Google here, have been hacked in the past. The New York Times, for instance, just recently was hacked by the Chinese government, of all people, and they had gotten into servers through employee computers. So someone left their computer unsecured either outside of the organization or in some other unsecure manner, and the hackers gained access that way. So in that case, no amount of server security could prevent the hack, because essentially the hackers were accessing the network in a legitimate fashion. This has also been the case with Twitter and Facebook, and there's been all sorts of these types of incidents that have happened where it's almost like a physical hack, like they've just gained access to someone's computer, which then has access to the secured network. So there's all types of ways that we can get into that hackers can get into private networks, but we want to take precautions. We want to use firewalls where we can. We want to make sure we're using SSL if we're going to have an e-commerce site or a public site up. And we want to make sure we're generally locking down our servers with secure passwords and secure usernames. Most of the time, hackers will try the basic stuff, and if it doesn't work, they'll move on to the next. So what we're trying to do is make it difficult enough to get into our server that it's not worth the time and that they move on to something else. Because generally speaking, if someone really, really wants to gain access to your system and they're hell-bent on doing that, then there's usually a way for them to get in. Very complex ways, but there are ways to get in nonetheless. So we want to make that as difficult as possible, and we want to mitigate those threats by just making it hard enough that they'll move on to the next server and they'll leave your site alone. So check the show notes below. There'll be some reading this week, and then there'll also be generally a writing assignment. So we're not going to be spinning up a server this week. There's going to be a writing assignment where I'm going to have you guys do some research on a particular company, maybe even reach out to them and ask them about their server infrastructure and the types of things that they use internally for security and for web servers and their general technology stack. So check that below, and I will see you guys next week.